Before he died, Johnny Carson told people about 9 guests who were secretly gay for 30 years. Johnny Carson welcomed America into his living room every night, making people feel close to Hollywood's biggest stars. But while the cameras were on, and millions of people watched from home, the famous Tonight Show host was keeping shocking secrets that would have immediately ruined the careers of his most famous guests. A former Tonight Show producer who worked with Carson in the 1970s and 80s said, "Johnny knew everything. Stars would appear on the show, make the audience like them, talk about their marriages and love lives, and Johnny would just smile, knowing that everything about them in public was a carefully made-up lie." He kept most of these secrets until he died. In his last years, though, Carson started being more honest with his close friends about the big lies he had seen during his career, especially about the real sexuality of popular stars who lived double lives for many years, hiding their true selves behind marriages set up by studios and carefully crafted public stories. The most shocking thing he revealed? America's most romantic leading man, the heartthrob who sat on Carson's couch many times, talking about his marriage, while living in fear that the host might ask one question that would reveal his entire life as a fake story created by the studio and the Hollywood perfect couple, whose famous 26-year romance was praised as the movie's greatest love story. While Carson knew it was actually a careful plan that let both stars hide their true sexuality from a judging public, these weren't just casual secrets or Hollywood gossip. They were life-and-death issues. In a time when being exposed meant instant career death, public shame, and possibly even criminal charges, the pressure of keeping these secrets, of doing interviews knowing the basic lie at their center, weighed heavily on Carson as he reflected on his career in his last years. But first, let's look at the most shocking truth of all: how America's most wanted leading man kept up a big lie through a studio-arranged fake marriage, while living in constant fear of being exposed. On television's most watched talk show. Chapter 1. Tyrone Power. The Matinee Idol's Secret. Life. Tyrone Power's striking good looks made him one of 20th Century Fox's most valuable properties. Throughout the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, his chiseled features and romantic appeal made him a natural for swashbuckling roles in films like The Mark of Zorro and Blood and Sand, while his dramatic talents shone in more serious works, like Witness for the Prosecution. A former staff member familiar with the host's thoughts explained, Carson never interviewed Power, who died in 1958, before Johnny took over The Tonight Show, but he heard many stories about him, from Hollywood veterans who appeared as guests, creating a picture of a star who lived a classic double life. According to people close to Carson, the host was particularly struck by how Power, whose image was built entirely around his appeal to women, reportedly kept a carefully divided existence. Relationships with men conducted with extreme secrecy, while studio publicity departments arranged dates with actresses to keep up his public image. A writer who discussed Hollywood history with Carson noted, "What interested Johnny was how completely Power's public and private lives were separated. During the day, he was the ultimate heartthrob, the man whose face launched 1,000 fan clubs. At night, according to Hollywood insiders, he sought companionship that would have instantly destroyed that carefully built image. Power's marriages, to French actress Annabella, to Mexican actress Linda Christian, and finally to Debbie Ann Menardos, provided necessary cover throughout his career. These relationships, particularly his 7-year marriage to Annabella, helped maintain the illusion of conventional heterosexuality that his career depended on. A friend of the late-night host said, Carson thought about the psychological burden of such arrangements. Many of these marriages weren't simply for show. They involved real emotional connections and resulted in children. The human reality was far more complicated than simple deception, revealing the limited options available to stars who didn't fit neatly into society's expectations. What made Power's case particularly notable was how his extraordinary physical beauty created both opportunity and danger. His looks opened doors to stardom, while simultaneously placing him under intense scrutiny. with audiences and fans developing possessive feelings about his romantic life that made authentic self-expression impossibly risky. A former producer explained, "Johnny would observe that the more physically perfect the star, the less freedom they had. Power's face was literally his fortune, creating expectations that became a prison. The irony that his beauty simultaneously created privilege and constraints wasn't lost on Carson. Power's early death at age 44, from a heart attack, cut short both his career and any possibility that he might have navigated the cultural changes that would begin to create more space for authentic self-expression in later decades. Like many of his contemporaries, he went to his grave with significant parts of his life hidden from the public that had adored him." Chapter 2. Charles Laughton and Elsa Lanchester. The double arrangement. Charles Laughton created unforgettable characters in films like The Hunchback of Notre Dame, Mutiny on the Bounty, and Witness for the Prosecution, while his wife Elsa Lanchester achieved fame as the Bride of Frankenstein and appeared in numerous films throughout her long career. Their marriage lasted from 1929 until Laughton's death in 1962, appearing to be one of Hollywood's most enduring unions. A former Tonight Show writer familiar with the host's private conversations revealed, Carson found the Laughton-Lanchester marriage particularly fascinating. Here was a couple where, according to Hollywood insiders, both partners were gay, creating what was essentially a mutual protection arrangement that safeguarded both their careers. According to people close to Carson, the host had heard from multiple reliable sources that Laughton was homosexual and that Lanchester was lesbian, making their marriage one of Hollywood's most elaborate cover arrangements, a union designed to give both partners respectable cover, while allowing them private freedom. A producer who worked on these segments noted, Johnny interviewed Lanchester several times after Laughton's death. He found it remarkable how she had constructed a public persona that honored their marriage, while carefully avoiding details that might contradict the official narrative of their relationship. What made the Laughton-Lanchester partnership particularly noteworthy was its longevity and apparent success. Unlike some studio-arranged marriages that crumbled under the weight of their artificiality, these two actors maintained their union for over 3 decades, developing what appears to have been a genuine friendship and creative partnership. Despite the absence of romantic or sexual connection, a friend who discussed Hollywood history with the host explained, Carson viewed their relationship as an ingenious solution to an impossible problem. In an era when being gay meant career death, they created a mutually supportive partnership that allowed both to thrive professionally while providing mutual protection. Lanchester's 1983 autobiography, Elsa Lanchester herself, touched only briefly on her relationship with Laughton, describing him as not an easy husband, but avoiding any direct discussion of his sexuality. This careful navigation of public disclosure versus private truth was typical of how stars of their generation approached such sensitive subjects, even as cultural attitudes began to shift. A former colleague noted, Johnny found it remarkable how thoroughly the Hollywood system had convinced the public that the marriage was conventional. Laughton played romantic leads and father figures. Lanchester played wives and mothers, and audiences accepted them in these roles without question, testament to both their acting abilities and the power of studio publicity to shape perception. The Laughton and Lanchester marriage represented, for Carson, a particularly elegant solution to the impossible choices faced by gay performers in their era, a mutually beneficial arrangement that allowed both partners to build successful careers while maintaining a measure of personal dignity that individual deception might have compromised. Chapter 3. Raymond Burr. The Fabricated life, Raymond Burr became one of television's most beloved figures. Through his portrayal of the brilliant defense attorney Perry Mason, and later as the wheelchair-bound detective Robert Ironside, his commanding presence and authoritative voice made him instantly recognizable to millions of viewers, who welcomed him into their homes weekly. For decades, a former Tonight Show staff member revealed, Carson interviewed Burr numerous times over the years, What he found most striking was the elaborate fictional biography Burr had constructed to conceal his homosexuality, an entire invented life story that Johnny had to pretend to believe. During their on-air conversations, according to people familiar with Carson's private reflections, the host was particularly struck by how extensive Burr's fabrications were. The actor claimed to have been married 3 times, with his first wife and their son supposedly killed in a plane crash during World War II. He spoke of military service that never occurred, and combat wounds he never received. None of it was true. A producer who worked closely with Carson said, Johnny described it as interviewing a character, rather than a person. He found it profoundly sad that Burr felt compelled to invent not just a heterosexual identity, but an entire tragic backstory, designed to elicit sympathy and deflect questions about his private life. In reality, Burr lived for the last 35 years of his life with his partner Robert Benavides, whom he met on the set of Perry Mason in 1960. They established a successful orchid-growing business and vineyard together, living as partners while publicly maintaining the fiction that they were merely business associates. A friend of the late-night host noted, what struck Carson was the psychological toll this must have taken. Burr was playing Perry Mason, a character dedicated to uncovering truth and fighting injustice, while living a life built around an elaborate deception, necessitated by the very injustice that might have ended his career. The irony that Burr, who played the ultimate truth-seeker in Perry Mason, had to live a life of calculated deception, wasn't lost on Carson. He viewed it as a particularly poignant example of the impossible choices forced upon gay performers. In mid-20th century America, a writer who worked with Carson explained, Johnny would reflect on the mental discipline required to maintain such extensive fabrications. Burr had to remember intricate details about marriages that never happened and a child who never existed. The cognitive burden of such sustained performance must have been enormous. After Burr's death in 1993, Benavides inherited his estate and has gradually revealed more about their life together. The fictional biography has been largely debunked, allowing for a more honest assessment of Burr's personal and professional achievements. Yet the elaborate deception he maintained for decades stands as testament to the impossible choices faced by gay celebrities in mid-20th century America. Chapter 4. Marlene Dietrich, the ultimate androgyne. Marlene Dietrich brought European sophistication and an air of sexual ambiguity to Hollywood that captivated American audiences. From her breakthrough performance in The Blue Angel to her collaborations with director Joseph von Sternberg, Dietrich crafted an image of transgressive glamour that challenged conventions in ways few American-born stars dared attempt. A former Tonight Show producer revealed, Carson interviewed Dietrich multiple times and genuinely admired her authenticity. He found it remarkable that she had managed to be relatively open about her fluid sexuality at a time when such honesty would have destroyed an American star's career. Unlike many of her Hollywood contemporaries, Dietrich made little effort to conceal her bisexuality from industry insiders. While married to Rudolf Sieber from 1923 until his death in 1976, she conducted well-documented affairs with both men and women, including relationships with actresses and female writers that were known within certain circles. A writer who worked closely with Carson explained, what impressed Johnny was Dietrich's refusal to be shamed. She constructed a persona where her sexual sophistication and European background created a space for her to live more honestly than most American stars could risk. Her marriage provided sufficient cover for her to pursue relationships that reflected her authentic desires. Dietrich's androgynous style, her penchant for wearing men's tailored suits, her husky voice, her commanding presence, incorporated elements of gender fluidity into her star image, transforming what might have been scandalous into an alluring component of her mystique. She made her ambiguity part of her mystery, converting potential liability into strength. A cultural historian who discussed Hollywood history with the host noted, Carson viewed Dietrich as someone who had figured out How to hide in plain sight. She didn't deny her nature. She made it chic, rendering her fluid sexuality part of her exotic appeal to American audiences, who could accept from a European what they would have rejected in an American star. Her relationship with her husband evolved into what today might be termed an open marriage, with Sieber himself living with another woman for much of their marriage, while maintaining a cordial relationship with Dietrich. This arrangement provided the actress both the respectability of marriage and the freedom to pursue relationships that reflected her genuine desires. A former colleague said, "Johnny found it fascinating how differently the public and press treated European stars versus American ones. Dietrich could get away with behaviors and presentations that would have ended an American actress's career instantly." The double standard revealed how much of Hollywood morality was about appearances rather than actual ethics. This strategic navigation of public expectations and private desires represented for Carson a rare example of someone who had achieved some measure of authentic self-expression within the constraining framework of studio-era Hollywood, a stark contrast to stars who maintained elaborate deceptions throughout their lives. Chapter 5. James Dean. The transactional career. James Dean appeared in just 3 major films before his death in a car crash at age 24. But his performances in East of Eden, Rebel Without a Cause, and Giant made him an enduring cultural icon. The quintessential troubled youth, whose brooding intensity spoke to a generation of teenagers seeking authentic emotion in a conformist era. According to people close to Carson, the host was particularly troubled by what he knew about the young actor's path to stardom. A former staff member familiar with the host's private conversations explained, "Carson never interviewed Dean. He died before Johnny took over The Tonight Show, but he heard countless stories about him from Hollywood insiders. What disturbed him were the persistent allegations that Dean had entered into relationships with powerful men, specifically to advance his career. These rumors, which circulated widely in Hollywood both during Dean's brief life and after his death, suggested that the young actor had been functionally bisexual, willing to leverage sexual relationships with influential industry figures as a means of overcoming the brutal competition for leading roles." A writer who worked with Carson said, "Johnny would reflect on how the public image of Dean as the ultimate rebel, authentic, uncompromising, true to himself, contrasted sharply with these accounts of his calculated use of relationships. He found it a particularly dark example of how the Hollywood system could corrupt even those who symbolized rebellion against conformity." Among the most persistent rumors were claims about Dean's relationships with influential director Rogers Brackett, who helped launch his career, and with other powerful men in the entertainment industry, who could open doors for an ambitious young actor. A friend of the late-night host noted, Carson was careful to emphasize that he didn't judge Dean for these choices. If the rumors were true, he viewed it as an indictment of a system that created such brutal power imbalances that talented young people felt compelled to commodify themselves to succeed. What particularly fascinated Carson was how Dean's early death transformed these rumors from potential career destroyers into components of his mystique. Because he died young, Dean was never forced to navigate the complexities of sustained fame in the way contemporaries like Brando did. His image, frozen at the moment of greatest promise and possibility. A former colleague said, Johnny observed that death had protected Dean from the scrutiny that might have exposed aspects of his life that would have been unacceptable to his fans. The tragedy of his premature death created a protective mythology that allowed multiple narratives about his life to coexist without resolution. This transformation of potentially damaging truth into romanticized legend represented for Carson a particularly powerful example of Hollywood's ability to reshape reality to serve its commercial and cultural interests, a theme that would resurface in his reflections on one of cinema's most daring international stars. Chapter 6. Marlon Brando, the open secret Marlon. Brando revolutionized screen acting with his raw, naturalistic performances, His portrayal of Stanley Kowalski in A Streetcar Named Desire, and later roles in films like On the Waterfront and The Godfather, established him as one of the most influential actors in cinema history. But according to people familiar with Carson's private conversations, the host was fascinated by the contradiction between Brando's reputation for brutal honesty on screen and the carefully managed presentation of his personal life. A former Tonight Show producer revealed, Carson interviewed Brando several times and found him uniquely challenging. Here was an actor celebrated for bringing total authenticity to his performances, yet he was simultaneously engaged in significant concealment about his private life, particularly his sexuality. Brando cultivated an image as a heterosexual womanizer, with highly publicized affairs with actresses, and a series of marriages that produced numerous children. Yet Carson reportedly knew, as did many in Hollywood, that Brando's sexual life was far more complex and fluid than his public image suggested. A writer who worked closely with the host said, Johnny would comment on the irony. Brando was celebrated as the harbinger of a new, more honest approach to acting. The man who stripped artifice from performance, yet in his personal life, he maintained significant fabrications about who he really was and whom he loved. In his later years, Brando became somewhat more candid about his sexuality, acknowledging in interviews that he had engaged in sexual relationships with men. But during the height of his fame in the 1950s and 60s, this aspect of his life remained carefully hidden, with studio publicity departments emphasizing his marriages and heterosexual relationships. A friend of the late-night host noted, Carson viewed Brando as someone who had struck a unique balance. He created sufficient traditionally masculine persona to protect himself from scrutiny, while gradually pushing the boundaries of what could be acknowledged. It was a sophisticated navigation of a treacherous cultural landscape. Rumors about Brando's relationships with other male stars, including James Dean, circulated throughout Hollywood for years. According to people familiar with Carson's reflections, the host was particularly interested in how these relationships intersected with the construction of American ideals of screen masculinity. A former NBC employee explained, Johnny found it fascinating that the two actors who redefined American masculine identity on screen, Brando and James Dean, were both allegedly engaged in relationships that would have shocked the audiences who idolized them. It revealed a profound disconnect between cultural imagery and reality that he found both disturbing and illuminating. This theme of image versus reality would continue in Carson's reflections on another celebrated rebel, whose brief career was shadowed by rumors about how he advanced in Hollywood. Chapter 7. Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy. The 26-year cover story, Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy's relationship, stands as one of Hollywood's most celebrated love stories, a 26-year romance that has been portrayed in books, documentaries, and films as the ultimate example of devoted partnership. Despite Tracy's refusal to divorce his wife, but according to people familiar with Carson's private conversations, the host knew that the true nature of their relationship was far more complex than the romantic legend suggested. A former Tonight Show staff member explained, Johnny had interviewed Hepburn many times and genuinely admired her, but he found it remarkable how completely the public had accepted a narrative about her relationship with Tracy that contained significant elements of fiction. According to Carson's private reflections shared with close friends late in his life, he believed that Hepburn and Tracy's relationship was primarily a mutually beneficial arrangement that allowed both stars to maintain their careers while deflecting questions about their sexual orientations. One of Carson's close friends recalled him explaining, the Hepburn and Tracy relationship served multiple purposes. For Tracy, a Catholic who wouldn't divorce his wife, it provided a socially acceptable explanation for his separation, without the scandal of dating around. For Hepburn, it offered a rationale for why such a desirable woman remained unmarried, while affording her the freedom to live largely as she pleased. Carson had observed how Hepburn's closest and longest relationships were predominantly with women. She lived with her alleged companion Laura Harding for many years, and later maintained a decades-long relationship with Phyllis Wilborn, whom some biographers claim she referred to as her wife. A historian who had discussed these matters with the late-night host noted, "What Carson found most striking was how the Hollywood publicity machine had transformed what was essentially a close friendship and professional partnership into the century's greatest love story. It was perhaps the most successful piece of myth-making in Hollywood history. Tracy's alcoholism and extended absences afforded Hepburn considerable independence, while her care for him during his final illness cemented the public narrative of their grand romance. The arrangement provided cover for both stars, while creating a story so compelling that it continues to obscure more complex truths about both their lives." A former colleague said, Johnny would point out that Hepburn's strategy for maintaining privacy was brilliant. Rather than participating in studio-arranged dates or marriages, she largely withdrew from the Hollywood social scene, creating a life in Connecticut and New York that remained separate from the film industry's constant surveillance. The Tracy relationship provided the perfect explanation for this independence. Carson found Hepburn's masculine style, which influenced fashion beyond the film world, particularly noteworthy as a form of quiet authenticity within an otherwise constructed public image. At a time when women's fashion was strictly feminine, Hepburn's preference for trousers, flat shoes, and minimal makeup represented a subtle rebellion against gender norms. A writer who worked with Carson reflected, he had enormous respect for how Hepburn had carved out space to be partially authentic in a system designed to enforce conformity. He viewed her as someone who had figured out how to live with dignity, despite the constraints of her era, an achievement he found genuinely admirable. This tension between public image and private reality would resurface in Carson's reflections on a star, whose intense performances may have been fueled by the strain of living a double life. Chapter 8. Cary Grant and Randolph Scott. The Secret Bachelor. Cary Grant embodied sophisticated masculinity. For generations of moviegoers, his impeccable style, his accent that blended British refinement with American ease, and his romantic pairings with Hollywood's most beautiful actresses created an image of the perfect ladies' man that persists in popular culture. Decades after his death, a former NBC employee familiar with the host's private comments explained, Carson had enormous respect for Grant's talents, but he found the disparity between Grant's public image and private life especially striking. Here was the man who literally defined suave sophistication, living a completely different reality behind closed doors. What particularly fascinated Carson was Grant's longtime living arrangement with fellow actor Randolph Scott, a rugged star known primarily for westerns. For over a decade, the two shared a beach house in Santa Monica that Hollywood insiders nicknamed Bachelor Hall, a cohabitation arrangement that was hidden in plain sight. A writer who worked closely with Carson revealed, during the peak years of both men's careers, Johnny would recount the experience of interviewing Grant and having to pretend he didn't know about the relationship with Scott. He found it surreal to discuss Grant's marriages. He had 5 during his lifetime, knowing that the most significant relationship in his life was with another man. What made the Grant-Scott relationship especially intriguing was how visible it was, while remaining officially unacknowledged. The two weren't exactly hiding. They posed for domestic photographs together that were published in fan magazines, showing them exercising, cooking meals, and relaxing at home, in ways that clearly suggested a cohabitating partnership, rather than mere friendship. A friend who discussed Hollywood history with the host said, Carson found those publicity photos fascinating. They depicted the two men in bathrobes having breakfast together, working out together, lounging by their pool, images that today would be immediately interpreted as depicting a couple. Yet, the studios managed to frame them as bachelor friends, sharing expenses. Grant maintained a carefully constructed public image through 5 marriages to women during his career. These marriages, especially in Grant's case, have been characterized by numerous historians as classic examples of Lavender marriages, relationships entered into primarily to maintain public heterosexual images. while providing cover for same-sex relationships. A former Tonight Show producer noted, Carson had profound sympathy for the psychological toll this exacted. He recognized that Grant had constructed an entire fictional identity. The Cary Grant persona was itself a creation that allowed the man-born Archibald Leach to navigate a hostile world that wouldn't accept his authentic self. While Carson never publicly discussed Grant's sexuality, in private conversations late in life, he reportedly expressed regret at having been part of the system that perpetuated these deceptions, the talk shows, magazines, and publicity apparatus that created narratives about stars that bore little relation to reality. A longtime friend said, Johnny felt that his show had been complicit in a system that forced people like Grant to live inauthentic lives. That tension between entertainment and exploitation, between public narrative and private truth, troubled him increasingly. As he aged and reflected on his career, this theme of public deception versus private reality would resurface in Carson's accounts of one of Hollywood's most celebrated romantic pairings, a famous coupling that the host knew was fundamentally different from how the public perceived it. Chapter 9. Rock Hudson. The heartthrob with the Lavender marriage, Rock Hudson was the ideal man for millions of American women in the 1950s and 60s. Tall, handsome, and possessing effortless charm, he became one of Hollywood's most bankable romantic leads, starring opposite actresses like Doris Day in comedies that cemented his image as the quintessential heterosexual male fantasy. A former Tonight Show writer familiar with Carson's private reflections said, "The irony was immense. Here was Johnny, night after night, interviewing the man that women across America fantasized about, knowing that Hudson's entire public persona was a carefully constructed fiction, designed to conceal his homosexuality." Hudson appeared on The Tonight Show numerous times during Carson's tenure, charming audiences with his good looks and anecdotes about his Hollywood life. But according to people close to Carson, these appearances created considerable anxiety behind the scenes for both the host and the guest. A former NBC employee who worked closely with the late-night program said, Carson knew Hudson was gay. It was an open secret in Hollywood circles, but he also understood the devastating consequences that exposure would have on Hudson's career. Every interview was a careful dance around the truth, with both men acutely aware of the dangerous topics that surrounded them. The pressure on Hudson was especially acute because of his function as a romantic leading man. Unlike character actors who might survive rumors about their sexuality, Hudson's entire career was predicated on his appeal to female audiences, who believed in the heterosexual image, carefully crafted by Universal Studios. A film historian who studies Hollywood's golden age explained, "This wasn't merely about personal privacy. Hudson's agent, Henry Wilson, had orchestrated his entire life, including a marriage to Wilson's own secretary, Phyllis Gates, to protect the fictional image that made Hudson a star. The stakes couldn't have been higher." The marriage to Gates lasted just 3 years, from 1955 to 1958, but served its purpose in deflecting rumors about Hudson's sexuality. According to people familiar with Carson's private conversations, the host found these studio-arranged Lavender marriages a particularly disturbing aspect of Hollywood's star system. A longtime friend of the late-night host said, Johnny described it as institutionalized deception. He wasn't judging anyone's sexuality, but he was troubled by the massive apparatus designed to deceive the public. As someone who interviewed people for a living, being forced to participate in these fabrications bothered him more than people realized. The tragic denouement of Hudson's double life came in 1985, when he died from AIDS-related complications, becoming one of the first major celebrities to succumb to the disease. His illness and subsequent death forced a public reckoning with his sexuality that he had spent his entire career trying to avoid. A producer who worked on The Tonight Show during this period noted, Carson was profoundly affected by Hudson's death. He felt that Hudson had been trapped in a system that didn't allow him to live authentically, and he viewed his own role in perpetuating these deceptions as increasingly problematic. As he grew older, This complex relationship between public image and private truth would be a recurring theme in Carson's reflections on his Hollywood encounters, nowhere more dramatically than in his accounts of one of cinema's most sophisticated leading men. Johnny Carson's revelations about these 9 Hollywood legends paint a vivid picture of an era when authenticity was a luxury few could afford. The studio system, with its carefully orchestrated publicity campaigns and arranged marriages, created an elaborate facade that allowed stars to achieve fame and fortune while living in constant fear of exposure. For Carson, who spent 3 decades interviewing these icons, the weight of maintaining these public fictions became increasingly burdensome. He understood that his show, like the entire Hollywood publicity machine, was complicit in a system that forced talented individuals to live inauthentic lives. What strikes most powerfully about these stories is not just the deception itself, but the human cost, the psychological burden of maintaining elaborate fabrications, the fear of a single slip that could destroy everything, the inability to live and love openly, all took their toll on these performers. Yet within these constraints, many found ways to carve out spaces of authenticity. Dietrich made her ambiguity alluring. Hepburn created independence through careful strategy. And some, like Laughton and Lanchester, formed partnerships that provided mutual protection and genuine friendship. Carson's decision to share these secrets in his final years reflected his evolving understanding of his own complicity in a system that demanded conformity at the expense of truth. These stories remind us that the glamorous images we see on screen often mask far more complex realities, and that the price of fame, in an unforgiving era, was often nothing less than the surrender of one's authentic self. If you found these revelations about Hollywood's golden age as fascinating as we did, please give this video a thumbs up. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Were you surprised by any of these stories? Do you think Hollywood has truly changed? Or are stars still hiding their authentic selves today? Don't forget to share this video with anyone who loves classic Hollywood history. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into entertainment's most captivating secrets. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.